All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Let's continue on talking about plants over here on your PowerPoint. And now we're going to talk about seed plants as we continue on. So let's give it a go as we go. Hey, come on, next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about vascular plants. And as we have mentioned before, when you talk about vascular tissue in a plant, we're talking about xylem and phloem. And of course, the xylem transports water and phloem is used to transport food. So plants that have true leaves, roots, and stems are vascular plants. Lignin, we already did this, didn't we? No, I guess we didn't. Okay, so some of this is a repeat, but that's okay. And the vascular plants, like some of the other ones we talked about, even some of the non-vascular ones, have lignin in their cell wall, and you might remember that that's used to strengthen the cell wall in addition to cellulose. Vascular plants are also Sporophyte Generation dominant, which means most of what you see as a plant is similar to how you know most living things are, which is they are diploid in the full organism state. So just a quick review of kind of some of the things we've seen in plants with the alternation of generations. We went with mosses that were sporophyte dependent on a gametophyte. So in a moss, remember this whole thing, most of the organism was a gametophyte, and growing out of the female gametophyte out of the archegonium was the sporophyte. And then we moved into talking about ferns with this structure here, if you remember that. Oh, there it is, the prothallus, and with the apical notch and the female gametophyte up near the apical notch, the sporophyte grew, and the whole fern that you see is then a sporophyte. And now we're going on to things like flowering plants, seed plants, where we'll have a sporophyte generation, and we'll have a very small gametophyte that is very reduced. And so this is basically wording of the same thing. Sporophyte dependent on gametophyte, like in mosses, large sporophyte and small independent gametophyte, as you see on ferns. And then in seed plants, we have a gametophyte that's dependent on the sporophyte. So I wonder, why do sporophyte dominant things exist? And a quick answer is that it helps reduce mutation damages. So UV light and things of that sort can be harmful to DNA. And so being diploid, having two copies, allows you to protect against one of them being damaged. So if one set of chromosomes or one gene on a chromosome is damaged, if your other one is functioning and you're a diploid organism, that can often counteract the negative effects of having one damaged allele in that case. So it gives you sort of double the odds of protection against that. And why evolutionarily, why might organisms maintain that gametophyte stage? And that's because in part the gametophyte stage is a way to screen alleles. So it doesn't require a large amount of energy to produce these gametophyte stages when they're small in particular. And if there's something damaged in the gametophyte that makes that allele not function, it sort of wipes out that bad genetic code. So it's a good way to screen alleles and get rid of those that might be damaged. And sometimes sporophytes will see the embryo, the little baby plant, if you will, relies on gametophyte tissue. When we talk about seeds, a seed, everybody knows, or thinks they do at least, what a seed is. And a seed is something that comes out of a plant. And a seed is really a sporophyte that's in a package. Okay, so when we talk about spores, those are only single cells. All right, and what a seed plant is going to do, it's going to have that spore that's the single cell that'll grow into a new plant, but it's going to be packaged with other things, with food that will help the plant grow. And when we talk about seed plants are what we call heterosporous, which means they make more than one kind of spore. So there are megasporangia that make large spores, which will be eggs. And there are microsporangia, which produce small spores, which will end up being sperm. So these will end up making the egg, and these will end up making the sperm. Okay? So the next thing is when we talk about the ovule. So when a seed becomes, when a female gametophyte, which has an ovule in it, becomes a seed, it transitions because it has to develop and be fertilized. So when you start with just the female structure, we call the female structure of the whole plant in that area, the reproductive part we call the ovule. And that includes several different things. It has the megasporangium in it, and the megasporangium can produce, of course, the megaspore, which ends up becoming the egg. And then the egg has to be pollinated and fertilized, and then inside, once the sperm fertilizes the egg, that becomes the new sporophyte. And then the surrounding tissue, the other surrounding tissue of the ovule, which serves to protect the baby growing sporophyte, serves as food as a protective coat. And so that's how we go from ovule to seed. All right. Now, when we talk about seed plants, there are a bunch of interesting things about seed plants. They're going to obviously produce seeds, and the seeds can remain dormant for many years. And we're going to end up seeing pollination as being a very big, successful delivery system for replacing swimming sperm. So as we move along this story in evolution, we're going to start seeing a transition from pollination being from a swimming sperm or water splashing on it to things driven by not just wind, but that comes as well, but also insects. We'll see a co-evolution of insects along with the flowering plants. The Gymnosperm generation is going to end up being reduced, and we'll see in Gymnosperms that they are going to end up lacking an antheridium altogether, and angiosperms will lack both an archegonium and an antheridium. So when we talk about the gametophyte being generation being reduced, means there's less of it. There's less structural support. So gymnosperms, which are going to be pine trees, are going to lack the male reproductive protective structures. So they'll still have the male producing structures, producing the sperm, but they won't have the protective structures. And then when we get to angiosperms, which are flowering plants, they'll end up lacking both of those. Now, this can be just a little bit confusing, so let me point out that when we talk about the antheridium and the archegonium, remember those are the cells that produce the sperm and the eggs, but they're also the protective structures around those. So it's not just the sperm and the egg, but things like paraphyses that also protect those cells. So when we say that the gymnosperms lack antheridium, what happens is, although the male parts to make sperm are still there in pollen, the number of structures decreases compared to the other things we've seen. So they no longer call that an antheridium. So it's still a male part because it produces sperm, and there's still a female part because the archegonium produces eggs. But what we're really losing is the protective structures around those. Okay, if we look at the phylogeny of some of the groups that appeared, and we'll get into this in more detail now, but we'll talk about angiosperms, which again are flowering plants, and we'll talk about gymnosperms, which are things like pine trees and others. We'll go through each of these different phyla or divisions, and you can see where they appear back here in the Paleozoic. They seem to split off from early seed plants appear back here around the Paleozoic, somewhere around the Devonian Carboniferous period. Since we're now talking about that, one of the things that we do in Bio 2 is we talk about the evolutionary geological timescale in the evolutionary record of when these different groups appear. So one thing that you need to start working on right now is you need to learn and be able to memorize the entire geological timescale you see here, which is actually a simplified version of how you can break this down. It gets in much more detail here. And it seems overwhelming at first, but what you want to do is you can come up with a mnemonic. So what you can do is you can come up with some kind of mnemonic. So you got your Cenozoic, your Mesozoic, Paleozoic, and your Precambrian eras. So what some people do is they write C, M, P, P, and then you can come up with a way to memorize the eras, and you do it with periods and so forth. And there's really a number of ways to do it. But I'll give you an example. Can many people play? I'll keep it nice, right? So you come up with a different version that works for you, and that helps you sort of memorize the different eras, periods, and epochs as we go through them. And that makes it much more manageable. So you want to start working on that. That will be definitely the one thing that I'm going to quiz or exam you on coming up soon. So you can start on that. Okay, so let's talk about now the Gymnosperms, which are also called the naked seed plants. And probably the most familiar to you of those is the conifera phyta, the pine trees. So we'll go through those. You're finally getting to where some of these things you can kind of walk around in your neighborhood and maybe see. And the first we'll do is the ginkgo phyta. And the ginkgo phyta are the ginkgo trees or maidenhair trees, which they commonly plant in cities. So maybe in your city it might be one of the trees that's on your local city plan that you can plant. So you might see them out planted in your neighborhood. They have very characteristic sort of fan-shaped leaves. We'll see them in lab as well. There's only one species and they're native to China, and only the males are planted here, and that is because the female plants, the fruit they produce it smells very bad, so people don't tend to like that. So we have three or four of them right outside of building 60 and by building 7, and those are ginkgos. The next is the Cycadophyta, and the Cycadophyta are also called the cycads, or they call them sago palms, and it sort of looks like a palm tree, and people sometimes confuse them for palm trees, but they're unrelated really to real palm trees. They're a totally different group of plants. So they're kind of short usually, and these have these palm-like leaves at the top, and they are the first group of plants in the evolutionary record to show true secondary growth. Secondary growth is what we're going to later define as being what we call wood, or it's going to be secondary xylem. So if you take probably the best example to think about, if you take a tree and you were to cut a tree and you count the tree rings, as you've probably seen before, those rings represent what's called secondary growth. And botanists call that kind of growth secondary growth or secondary xylem, and they call that the wood of the plant. And evolutionarily, cycads are one of the first groups to show that. Then we have the Netophyta, and the Netophyta, there are 3 genera of them, and the most common one we'll talk about in here is the one called ephedra. And ephedra is also called Mormon tea. And Mormon tea is, in the Netophyta, has a chemical or drug in it called ephedrine. And ephedrine does things like raise your heart rate and raise your blood pressure. And so people would put some of this ephedra plant in some hot water and drink it like a tea, and it's a stimulant. It's sort of like a type of amphetamine, and they marketed things like ephedrine at one point as a weight loss supplement, and I think there were a bunch of lawsuits over people having heart-related cardiovascular disease issues because, you know, it's a stimulant. It's a very strong stimulant, and it could be harmful probably in large doses. But you'd probably lose weight because you're speeding up your metabolism. There you go. There's that. All right. Next is the Coniferophyta, and the Coniferophyta are the pine trees. And once again, we're finally getting to more things you're probably familiar with. Most people know what a pine tree looks like, hopefully. And so one thing you're going to have to be able to know is the life cycle of a pine tree. And like all our other life cycles, what I'd have you do starting out is you'd draw a line and you'd write your 2 in and your in, and then you'd write meiosis, just like we've done before. And then you draw the structures on it there. I'll put up my best possible drawing, which still won't be very good, but just to show you kind of how I would do that. I'll point some things out on this because the pictures here are much better than what I can draw. But on a pine tree, it turns out there are 2 different types of cones. So everybody knows probably what a pine tree is and that what a pine cone is. But it turns out there are 2 pine cones, 2 kinds of pine cones. The ones that are high up in the tree, up here, the ones you're used to, are called ovulate cones. Those are the female cones, and that's where the egg is going to be. And then there are male cones, and the male cones are much lower on the tree, and they're usually sort of paper-like, paper thin, and kind of break apart. And those distribute the pollen, and the pollen blows in the air to the female pine cone. I'll show you some examples of that here. So here's the male pine cones there. So when we talk about the male pine cones, they again, the pine tree is a Sporophyte Generation dominant plant with both male and female cones, and the ones that are low on the tree are the staminate cones. Those are the males, and they produce pollen. And then we have the ovulate cones. Those are high up in the tree, and those end up producing the seeds. That's the female version of it. If we talk about the male, first of all, remember the male has no antheridium in it, and really the difference there is because it lacks the protective cells. So there are still the structures that produce a sperm. That's called the microsporangia, but we say it no longer has an antheridium because it lacks the protective structures of it. So that microsporangia will produce a pollen grain, which will be 4 individual cells. And those cells end up being 2 what we call prothallal cells, 1 generative cell, and that 1 generative cell is going to produce 2 sperm. That comes up to be kind of important much later on when we talk about flowering plants, which we'll get to next time. And then 1 tube cell. And one of the things you'll see about pine trees is that they have wings on the pollen. So a pollen from a pine tree is going to sort of look like a Mickey Mouse thing like that. So that'll be the pollen under a microscope, and these will be what we call the wings, and that helps it blow through the air. When we talk about the female ovule is going to be an ovulate cone, and it is going to have the female megasporangia, which will produce 4 megaspores. Of those 4 megaspores, 3 of them basically die out and we don't use them, but the one that remains out of that becomes and develops into the female gametophyte. So that 1 cell forms the archegonium, which will also have the egg in it. So in this particular case, we have our egg and our reproductive protective structures. So once again, here's the life cycle here. Here's the male cone there. There's the female cone. And what we're doing is we're delivering from a different tree, really. I think I mentioned this before. When they draw these drawings, they make it simplistic, making it sort of look like this one tree fertilizes itself. But again, most living things have some kind of mechanism for sexual reproduction such that it doesn't fertilize itself. So this is probably 2 different trees, and there are a lot of mechanisms for that. We'll discuss some of those later. But the idea is that the pollen from one tree reaches the female cone from another tree, and that is then pollination. And then once that sperm fertilizes the egg, you develop into a brand new sporophyte there. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope that gets you started on some plant stuff, and let's keep moving on.